I'm Eric Warren. I moved into an old apartment building in the city, a place known for its quiet charm and historical appeal. Everyone talked about it like it was a piece of history, with its brick facade and vintage interiors. It was perfect. I found the locked room. When I first toured the apartment, everything seemed fine. The place was spacious, filled with sunlight that streamed through the large windows. But it wasn't until I started unpacking and exploring every corner that I noticed something odd. At the end of the narrow hallway, there was a door that didn't seem to belong. It was smaller than the others, and there was no handle, just an old, rusted keyhole. I asked the building manager about it, but she seemed to avoid the question. "It's just an old storage closet," she said, her voice tight. "It's been locked for years. We don't really use it." But something about the way she said it struck me. She didn't seem convincing, and there was a strange look in her eyes, like she was hiding something. The door nagged at me every day. I couldn't understand why it was locked. Was there something valuable inside, or something dangerous? After a few weeks of living there, curiosity got the best of me. One night, while everyone else in the building was asleep, I went to the door. I brought a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to find out what was behind it. The moment I pried the door open, I felt a cold draft sweep through the apartment. The air behind the door was stale, and the darkness felt thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. I stepped inside, the flashlight beam flickering slightly in the cold air. The room was tiny, no bigger than a closet, but it felt wrong. It was lined with old, decaying bookshelves that had been emptied long ago. Dust hung in the air like a fog, and there was a sense of weight in the room, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then I noticed it. At the far corner of the room, under a pile of old rotting blankets, was a strange, metallic object. I pulled the blankets away, revealing a small, rusted metal box. It was locked, just like the door, with an intricate lock I couldn't quite understand. It felt cold to the touch, and when I lifted it, I could hear something faintly moving inside. I wasn't sure if I should open it, but the thought of whatever was inside gnawed at me. So I searched the room for something to pry it open with, eventually finding an old screwdriver hidden in a drawer in the corner. With shaking hands, I managed to open the box. Inside was a small, faded photograph. It was old, so old, it seemed to have withered with time. The photograph showed a family standing in front of the very building I was living in. They looked happy, smiling in the sunlight, but there was something about their faces that felt wrong. Their eyes were blank, hollow, as if they weren't really there. I pulled it out, inspecting it closely, and that's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone was breathing down my neck. I spun around, but there was no one in the room. I felt it then, like the air had shifted, becoming thicker, more oppressive. The whispers started again, growing louder, and this time, I could make out words, though they were barely more than a hiss. "Get out!" I dropped the photograph, my heart pounding. The whispers became a roar, filling my ears, echoing in the small room. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to be closing in on me. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand grip my wrist, pulling me backward. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the overwhelming silence that followed. The room was suffocating, the walls pressing in, and in that instant, I understood. The room wasn't just locked, it was a prison. I stumbled out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I could still hear the whispers, following me, relentless. But when I turned the handle to leave the apartment building, I found the door wouldn't open. It was stuck frozen in place. The hallway stretched on forever, and the walls seemed to close in on me, just like in that room. The building had become my cage. I never saw the manager again. I don't know where she went, but I found her photo in the same box I'd opened. The photo of the family, with her standing right there, her hollow eyes staring back at me. I don't know how long I've been trapped in this building, but I know one thing for sure. If you ever find a locked room, don't open it. Don't even try. Some doors should never be unlocked. Some secrets are meant to stay hidden, and the building, it doesn't let you leave once you know too much. My name is Jessica Marlowe, and I never believed in anything supernatural until the walls started whispering. It all began when I moved into the old Victorian house on Maple Street. The place had been empty for years, but the rent was affordable, and I wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. The house was large, with high ceilings and long hallways, giving it an eerie feeling, even during the day. The previous tenants had left abruptly, and the landlord couldn't or wouldn't explain why. Still, I was eager to settle in. The first night was quiet enough. I unpacked, made some tea, and tried to ignore the creeping unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. But that night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper, like someone was standing just outside my door, breathing quietly. I thought it was the wind, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just in my room, it was everywhere. Sometimes it was in the walls, other times it came from the floorboards, and occasionally, I'd hear it in the corners of the ceiling, just out of sight. It was never clear what the voices were saying, just faint, hushed words I couldn't make out. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was nothing, but it didn't stop. It only got worse. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I decided to investigate. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to locate where it was coming from. I wandered through the house, room by room, and eventually ended up in the hallway. Standing in front of the largest room in the house, the master bedroom, the whispers seemed to be coming from behind the walls. I pressed my ear to the cool wood, listening carefully. The voices were clearer now, though still muffled. I could make out a few words, distorted and twisted, but none that made sense. Then, one word cut through the silence like a knife. Help. I recoiled, stumbling backward, my breath quickening. The whisper had come from the wall itself, not just a voice in my head, but something real, something trapped. The air in the hallway grew colder, and I shivered as an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me. I knew I had to know what was behind that wall. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox in the kitchen and began to pry at the wall. It was old, the plaster cracked and brittle. With every strike, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until I had torn a small hole large enough to peer inside. What I saw made my stomach twist with fear. Behind the wall was a small, dark alcove, and inside it was something I couldn't explain. Old, yellowed photographs, broken mirrors, and a thick layer of dust that had been undisturbed for decades. But the most disturbing thing was the shape in the corner, hidden beneath layers of cloth. I pulled the cloth back, my hands trembling, revealing an old, decayed mannequin, its face twisted into a grotesque smile. The mannequin's eyes were hollow, and its mouth, curled into an unsettling grin, was open as if it had been screaming for years. I recoiled, nearly falling backward. The whispers stopped. Silence, and then, as if the mannequin was alive, it moved. The entire room seemed to shift. Around me, the walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and I could hear the whispers again, louder, closer. The mannequin's head jerked to the side, its empty eyes locked onto mine. I tried to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me in the room. Help, ... The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, filled with pain and desperation. I rushed to the door, frantically trying to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in on me. The whispers, now a chorus of frantic voices, all shouting at once, screaming, begging for something I couldn't understand. In the corner of my eye, I saw the mannequin move again. It stood up, its limbs jerking unnaturally, and started to crawl toward me. Its face stretched into that horrific grin. I don't remember how I escaped. My mind is a blur, but somehow I managed to break free from the room. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I was far away. The whispers followed me for days after, echoing in my mind. I never returned to the house on Maple Street, but every so often, I hear the whispers again, quiet at first, but growing louder. And when I close my eyes, I see the mannequin's face, staring at me from the shadows. Some houses are never meant to be lived in, and some walls are better left undisturbed. If you ever hear whispers in the walls, don't listen. You might not like what you find. I'm Henry Dawson. I never believed in ghost stories, not even the ones my grandmother told me when I was young. But that was before I moved into the old farmhouse on Birchwood Drive. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat from the hustle and bustle of the city, a place to escape for a while. I never expected it to come with such a dark history. The farmhouse had been abandoned for years. The previous owners had left in a hurry, as the neighbors explained, but no one seemed to know exactly why. The place was falling apart, with broken windows and creaking floorboards. But it was the basement that caught my attention. When I first saw the door to the basement, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was old, the wood darkened and warped with age. A rusty lock hung from the door, and the hinges squealed with an unsettling sound when I tried to open it. But curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't resist. The landlord had warned me, though. "Don't go into the basement," he said, his voice low and almost fearful. "It's better to leave it alone." But that only made me more determined. I couldn't ignore it. There had to be something down there. Something that had kept the previous owners from returning. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, I decided to investigate. I found an old key hidden in the kitchen drawer, its shape familiar, like it had been there for years, waiting to be used. I didn't think twice before unlocking the basement door. The air was thick, damp, and cold when I stepped inside. The smell of rot hit me immediately. The basement was vast, filled with boxes and forgotten furniture. But there, in the far corner, I noticed something strange. A large, covered object stood against the wall. It looked like a wardrobe, but it was too large, and it didn't belong. As I approached it, the air grew colder. My breath became visible, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. There was something about the wardrobe, it felt wrong. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. With trembling hands, I reached out and pulled the dusty cloth off the object. It wasn't a wardrobe. It was a large, old-fashioned mirror. The frame was dark wood, carved with intricate patterns I couldn't quite make out. The glass was foggy, but as I wiped it away, the reflection became clearer. But what I saw in that reflection wasn't me. It was a man, standing behind me. His face was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. I was alone in the basement. I turned back to the mirror, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The man in the reflection hadn't moved, but his mouth was slowly beginning to open, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. The air grew even colder, and I could see my breath swirling in front of me. Suddenly, the mirror seemed to come to life. The image of the man's face twisted into something grotesque, and I could hear a voice, low, rasping, and full of malice. "You shouldn't have opened it." I couldn't breathe. Panic surged through me as the man in the mirror began to move. His hands pressed against the glass as if he were trying to reach out to me. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, but the door to the basement slammed shut on its own. I was trapped. The mirror's reflection flickered, and I heard the man's voice again, closer this time. "You're not leaving." The basement grew colder still, and I felt something pulling at my feet, like invisible hands were trying to drag me back. I fought with every ounce of strength I had, but the darkness closed in around me. I screamed, banging on the basement door, but no one came. Just as I thought I couldn't escape, I heard the door to the basement creak open. Light flooded in, and I bolted up the stairs, barely escaping the suffocating darkness below. The door slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed, gasping for air. I don't know what I saw in that mirror, but I know it wasn't human. I never returned to the basement. The mirror is still down there, locked away in the darkness. They say there's a secret in every house, a truth that's buried beneath the floorboards. Some secrets should stay buried. I learned that the hard way, and I won't make the mistake of going back to that basement again. If you ever find yourself in a house with a locked basement, don't open it. Don't even think about it. Some things are better left undisturbed. My name is Sophie Clark. I don't believe in ghosts. At least, I didn't. Not before. I moved into the house on Meadow Lane. I thought it was just a rumor when the neighbors spoke about strange noises and flickering lights. That was until the key dot. The house itself wasn't special. It was old, yes, but nothing I couldn't handle. A two-story colonial that had been vacant for years, with a large unused basement that no one ever spoke about. It seemed perfect for a fresh start, and I signed the lease without thinking twice. The first week was uneventful. I unpacked, got settled in, and began enjoying the peace and quiet. But then, one night, I heard it. It started with a soft scraping noise, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. It came from the basement. At first I ignored it, assuming it was just the house settling. But then the noises grew louder. It was impossible to ignore. I had to check. I stood in front of the basement door, my hand resting on the cold doorknob. I had never opened it before. I didn't even know if it was locked, but as I twisted the knob, it creaked open with ease. The air inside was thick, damp, and carried a faint, unpleasant odor there. On the floor of the basement was an old wooden chest. It looked out of place, like it had been there for decades. And on the chest, there was a single key. It was unusual, old and brass, with intricate markings that seemed almost ancient. I didn't know why, but I felt drawn to it. I picked it up, and the moment my fingers closed around it, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't explain it, but I knew this key wasn't meant to be found. The noises stopped. The air in the basement grew still. I felt a sense of unease creep over me, and without thinking, I pocketed the key and closed the basement door behind me. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just an old house, just an old chest. Nothing to worry about. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in my room felt colder, the silence more oppressive. I reached over to the nightstand, where the key now sat, untouched. And that's when I heard it. The whisper. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Open it. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was low, gravelly, and it seemed to come from the depths of the house itself. It repeated again, louder. This time, open it, Sophie. I sat up, drenched in sweat, staring at the key. I couldn't resist. I had to know what it opened. I grabbed it, my fingers trembling as I headed back to the basement. The door creaked open once again. The chest was still there, sitting in the middle of the room. My breath hitched as I approached it, the key now heavy in my hand. I knelt down, inserted the key into the lock, and twisted. The chest creaked open, and inside, there was nothing but darkness. But as I peered inside, I felt something cold brush against my skin, something that wasn't air. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the shadows around me seemed to deepen. The voice returned, but this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream. You shouldn't have opened it. I stumbled backward, slamming the chest closed, but it was too late. The basement seemed to come alive, the walls groaning, the floorboards creaking. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into complete darkness. I don't know how I managed to escape. I ran up the stairs, the sound of something following close behind me. I don't know what was in that chest, but I know one thing for sure. It wanted to stay hidden. I moved out the next morning, leaving the house on Meadow Lane behind. But the key, I couldn't leave it behind. It's still in my possession, sitting on my desk, and every so often, I hear a soft, scraping noise coming from the shadows. It's getting louder, and I can feel it. The thing in the chest, it's still out there, waiting. Whatever you do, never pick up a key you're not meant to find. Some doors should never be opened. I'm Evan Hayes. I moved into my new apartment on a cold, dreary November afternoon. The building wasn't much handled, 5-story walk-up in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The rent was cheap, and it felt like the perfect place to start over. No questions asked. It was the kind of place that had history, too much of it, in fact. The landlord, an elderly man with a permanent scowl, warned me about one thing when I signed the lease. Don't go into the basement. He said it with such urgency that I didn't question him. I moved in, unpacked, and settled in quickly. The apartment itself was quiet, almost too quiet, which I liked. The building had a sort of eerie charm to it, like it was holding its breath. But as I sat on the couch one evening, the faint sound of something thumping from below caught my attention. At first, I assumed it was just old pipes, or the building settling, but as the days went on, the thumps grew louder, more rhythmic. One evening, curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my coat, put on some shoes, and headed down to the basement. The door was heavy, made of old oak, and it creaked as I pushed it open. The stairs were steep, leading down into complete darkness. I felt a cold breeze hit me as I descended, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At the bottom of the stairs was a long hallway. The air was thick with must and mildew, the smell almost suffocating. I moved forward, drawn to the source of the noise. The thumping was louder now, like something where someone was banging against the walls. I walked down the hallway, passing old storage units and boxers, until I reached the last door at the very end. It was an old, rusted door, covered in layers of dust. The thumping was coming from behind it, louder than ever. My heart pounded as I slowly turned the handle and opened the door. Inside was nothing but a small, dark room. The walls were covered in strange marking symbols I couldn't recognize. But there was something more unsettling in the middle of the room. A large, ornate mirror stood against the far wall, reflecting the dim light from the hallway. Suddenly, the thumping stopped, and then, silence. Absolute silence. I couldn't look away from the mirror. My reflection was there, but something was off. It was me, yes, but it didn't feel like me. My reflection stood still, staring back at me with cold eyes. I reached out to touch the mirror, and just as my fingers brushed the surface, a voice, low, distorted whispers sounded from the depths of the room. Evan, I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection in the mirror moved its lips, curled into a grin, something twisted and unnatural. It wasn't me. It couldn't be. Without thinking, I turned and ran, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My heart raced, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I rushed back up the stairs. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door, but the image of that grin haunted me. I didn't sleep that night. In fact, I haven't slept properly since. The thumping returned, but this time it wasn't just coming from the basement. I could hear it in the walls, in the floorboards, even in the air. And the worst part? The reflection in the mirror keeps showing up when I least expect it, just standing there, watching me, waiting. I don't know what's in the basement. I don't know who or what was calling my name. But one thing's for sure, I'll never go back down there again. If you ever move into an old building with a basement that's locked away, don't ignore the warnings. Some things are better left undiscovered. I wish I could forget what I saw, but I can't. The echoes from below still haunt me, and no matter where I go, they follow. My name is Alex Carter, and I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. That was until I moved into the old house on Oak Street. The place had been abandoned for years, and no one knew exactly why. I didn't care about the rumors. It was cheap, and I needed a fresh start. The house was large, with peeling paint and an overwhelming smell of dust and neglect. But the most intriguing feature of the house was the basement. The door to the basement was old, with intricate carvings I couldn't quite decipher. It was always locked, and the landlord was adamant that I should never try to open it. That only made me more curious. After a few weeks of settling in, I decided to investigate. One night, when the house was quiet, I found a small key hidden in an old drawer in the kitchen. It was an antique key, tarnished with age, and I knew it had to fit the basement door. My heart raced as I approached the door, the feeling of anticipation almost suffocating me. I inserted the key into the lock, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a set of steep, narrow stairs descending into darkness. I stood frozen for a moment, feeling a chill run up my spine. There was something about that basement, something that felt off, even though I couldn't explain why. As I descended into the darkness, I felt a weight pressing on my chest. The air was damp, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step. The floor was covered in dust, and the walls were lined with old, cobweb-covered shelves. There was a faint smell of mildew and something else, something I couldn't place. I moved further into the basement, my flashlight flickering as I tried to illuminate the space. Then, I saw it. A large, wooden chest was sitting in the corner, almost as if it had been waiting for me. The moment I saw it, an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. I didn't want to open it, but I couldn't resist. My hands shook as I slowly approached the chest. It was locked, but I didn't need to think twice. I had the key. The lock clicked open with an eerie sound, and I lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but a few tattered old blankets. But as I reached in to touch them, something moved. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, and I quickly pulled my hand back. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I realized the blankets weren't just old, they were breathing. A shadow shifted beneath them, and before I could react, something grabbed my arm. I screamed, pulling away, but the grip tightened. My flashlight fell to the floor, spinning wildly as I tried to free myself from whatever had me in its grasp. In the darkness, I could hear a voice, low and guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Panic surged through me as I fought to break free. I managed to stumble backward, falling to the floor, and when I looked up, the chest was closed. The whispers had stopped. Everything was still. I rushed back up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back up. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, and when I tried to return to the basement, the door was locked again. No key in sight. I haven't been back since, but I still hear those whispers when I'm alone. I don't know what's down there, or what I unleashed, but I know one thing. I've made a terrible mistake. The house on Oak Street is still abandoned, and I've moved out. But if you ever come across it, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't open the forgotten door. My name is Ethan, and I wish I had never opened the basement door. It all started when I moved into my grandfather's old house after he passed away. He had always been a quiet, reclusive man, and his house reflected that dusty furniture, thick curtains that blocked out the sunlight, and a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The only part of the house that truly unsettled me, though, was the basement. I wasn't allowed to go down there as a child. Whenever I asked about it, my grandfather would grow silent, his face darkening. "Some doors are better left closed," he would say. But now, the house was mine, and so was the basement. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a dull, rhythmic knocking from below. 3 slow knocks. A pause, then 3 more. I sat up, my heart hammering. The house was empty. I told myself it was just the old wood settling, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the basement door, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air around it was freezing. I reached for the handle, hesitated, then turned it. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a staircase leading into pitch darkness. I swallowed my fear and stepped inside. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight, and the air smelled of damp rot. My flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, revealing a space filled with forgotten relics, dust-covered trunks, rusted tools, and broken furniture. Then I saw it, a single chair, positioned in the center of the room, facing the wall. Chains lay coiled around its legs, as if something had once been restrained there. The dust around it was disturbed, as though someone or something had been pacing in circles. I stepped closer, and that's when I noticed the carvings. Deep scratches covered the surrounding walls, erratic and desperate. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something shift in the shadows. Then the whispering began. It started as a faint murmur, words I couldn't quite understand, but with each passing second, it grew clearer. A voice, hoarse and pleading. "Ethan, let me out." I spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew thick, suffocating. The whispering turned to sobs, then guttural inhuman laughter. The walls trembled, and a deep, guttural growl resonated through the basement. Panic surged through me. I turned to run, but the stairs seemed farther away than before, stretching endlessly upward. My flashlight sputtered, plunging the room into darkness. Something moved, a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails dragging against stone. My breath caught in my throat as I felt the presence behind me. Close, too close. Then, a touch cold, skeletal fingers grazing the back of my neck. I bolted, stumbling up the stairs, my legs heavy, as if the air itself were trying to pull me back. I reached the top and slammed the door shut, locking it, my chest heaving. The knocking started again. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I haven't gone near the basement since, but at night, I still hear it. And every morning, when I check the door, I find the lock undone. My name is Oliver, and I have always been afraid of basements. As a child, I used to have nightmares about being trapped underground, surrounded by whispering voices. My parents always told me it was just my imagination, that there was nothing in the dark waiting for me. I believed them until last night. I recently moved into an old house on the outskirts of town. It was a fixer-upper, but I loved the idea of restoring it. The only part I refused to touch was the basement. I told myself it was just because I had no reason to go down there. But deep down, I knew it was fear. The house had other plans. Last night, as I was settling in for bed, I heard something, a dull, rhythmic thudding sound, like someone knocking from beneath the floor. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it open, heart pounding. I stepped closer. The air around the doorway was ice cold. I reached out, hesitating only for a second before pushing the door open all the way. The stairs disappeared into blackness. The knocking had stopped. I told myself it was just an old house settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting down there. I took a deep breath and descended. The smell of damp earth and mildew hit me immediately. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, empty except for a few rusted tools. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven. Then I saw them. Handprints. Dozens of them, smeared across the walls, as if someone had been clawing their way up from the floor. Some were small, like a child's, while others were far too large to belong to any human I had ever seen. My flashlight flickered, and I felt the presence, heavy, watching. A whisper brushed against my ear. "Oliver." I spun around, but the basement was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as the whispering continued, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. Then, the worst part, the handprints. They were moving, crawling across the walls, shifting toward me. The air grew thick, pressing against my chest, making it impossible to breathe. My legs locked in place as the darkness seemed to deepen. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices calling my name over and over. My flashlight flickered violently before dying completely, plunging me into pitch black. A soft, wet sound echoed from the farthest corner of the basement. Something was moving, dragging itself across the floor. I could hear it breathing. I forced myself to move, breaking free of whatever invisible force held me in place. I ran. I took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly falling in my desperation to escape. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. The whispering stopped, but now, every night, I hear scratching from beneath the floorboards, and I know whatever I left down there is trying to get out, and one day, it will. My name is Nathan, and I never believed in ghosts until last night. I moved into this house 2 weeks ago. A beautiful but surprisingly cheap old Victorian home. It had everything I wanted: space, charm, and a decent backyard. But there was one thing that made me uneasy from the start. The basement. Unlike the rest of the house, which had been well maintained, the basement door had been sealed shut, not locked sealed. Thick nails and heavy wooden planks reinforced it, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure no one ever opened it again. When I asked the previous owner about it, he simply shook his head. "For safety reasons," he muttered, refusing to elaborate. Of course, that only made me more curious. Yesterday my curiosity won. It took almost an hour, but I finally pried the last plank off. The moment I did, a gust of stale air rushed out, carrying a smell of damp earth, rust, and something else, something metallic. It reminded me of blood. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The air was thick, heavy, like the walls were pressing in on me. My flashlight beam swept across the space stone walls, a dirt floor, and an old wooden table in the center. A mirror leaned against the far wall, covered in dust and grime. I had expected a cluttered, forgotten storage space, but the room was eerily empty. Then I heard it, a whisper. "Nathan, .. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but unmistakably real. My flashlight shook slightly as I turned in a slow circle, searching for the source. Nothing, just silence. Swallowing hard, I stepped forward. The whisper came again, this time from the mirror. My breath caught in my throat. I approached, heart hammering. Wiping away the dust with my sleeve, I stared at my reflection. At first, everything seemed normal until my reflection moved a second. Too late. My stomach dropped. Then, it smiled at me. I didn't move, couldn't move. My reflection, my own face, was smirking at me, eyes dark and hollow. Then its lips moved, but the voice came from behind me. "Let me out." I spun around, but the basement was empty. My own breath echoed in the tight space. Slowly, I turned back to the mirror. The reflection was gone. My flashlight flickered, and the whispering started again, but now it was everywhere above me, behind me, inside my head. Shadows stretched unnaturally in the corners of the room. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating me. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. up the stairs, through the doorway, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I locked it, heart pounding against my ribs. Silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. Maybe the air down there had made me hallucinate. But then a knock from the other side of the door. Slow, deliberate. Nathan, ... The voice whispered. I backed away. The door handle rattled. Something was trying to get out. Then, the whispering stopped. A moment of stillness stretched into eternity, and then the lock clicked in locking itself. I haven't opened the door again, but I know it's only a matter of time, because now, I hear footsteps coming up the stairs. My name is Daniel, and I should have never gone down to the basement. My family moved into this house a month ago. It's an old place, with creaky floors, and a draft that never quite goes away. My wife, Claire, loved the charm of it, and my daughter Emily was just happy to have a big backyard to play in. But there was one thing we all avoided: the basement. It wasn't locked, but the door had an odd, heavy feel to it, as if it resisted being opened. The previous owners had left no explanation, just a warning. Don't go down there after dark. I ignored it. Last night, I finally gave in to curiosity. I waited until everyone was asleep, grabbed a flashlight, and pulled the door open. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended into the cold, musty darkness. The basement was larger than I expected, with stone walls and an uneven dirt floor. Old furniture sat covered in sheets, but something about the place felt wrong. Then I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. The dust should have been undisturbed, but a clear set of bare footprints led from the center of the room to the corner where a wooden cabinet stood. The air around it felt heavier, colder. My flashlight flickered as I approached. I hesitated, but then I gripped the handle and pulled the cabinet door open. Empty, or at least, that's what I thought, until I noticed the deep, jagged scratches along the inside, like something had been trapped inside, desperately clawing to get out. Then the basement door slammed shut. Upstairs, I turned so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. My breath came in short gasps as I ran up the stairs, but the door wouldn't budge. I banged against it, calling for Claire, for Emily, anyone. Silence. Then, the whisper came, right behind me. Daniel. I spun around. My flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows along the walls. The footprints in the dust, they had changed. Now they led toward me. A slow, deliberate creak came from the corner. The cabinet door, the one I had left open, was swinging shut. But before it closed completely, I saw something inside. A pair of hollow, sunken eyes, staring back at me. The whisper came again, closer. Daniel, let me out. The light went out, and in the darkness, I felt a cold breath against my ear. My name is Thomas. I've always been drawn to the forest, ever since I was a child. The deep woods were my refuge, my escape, but I never knew the truth about them until that night. It started as a simple camping trip, just me and a few friends, Sarah, Max, and Luke. We decided to go deep into the heart of the forest, far from the usual paths, to experience the wilderness like never before. No one had ever warned us about the forest's curse. If they had, I don't think we would have gone. We set up camp near an old, overgrown clearing, the ground soft and wet from the rain earlier in the day. The trees towered around us, their trunks wide and dark, like sentinels guarding some ancient secret. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew quiet. Too quiet. We gathered around the campfire, telling stories and laughing, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of unease that seemed to settle over us. But then, just as the fire flickered low, we heard something, a rustling in the trees. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, as if something or someone was watching us. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Probably just a deer," Max said, trying to brush it off. But there was an edge to his voice that I couldn't ignore. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't an animal. It was a voice. Soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. "Help me." We all froze. The voice sounded human, desperate. But no one else was supposed to be out here. We were miles from the nearest trail, deep in the woods. I grabbed the flashlight, and we all stood up, looking around the darkened trees. "What is that?" Luke whispered, pointing to the edge of the clearing. There, standing between two ancient oaks, was a figure, a man, hunched over, his head lowered, like he was hiding something. We called out to him, but he didn't respond. Slowly, he raised his head, and the sight made my stomach turn. His face was pale, drawn, his eyes wide and black like endless voids. He looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His clothes were tattered, hanging off his frame like they belonged to someone else, and in his hand, he held something that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Stay away from the trees," he rasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. We didn't understand what he meant, but then something strange happened. The ground beneath our feet seemed to tremble, and the trees around us shifted, their branches creaking and groaning. It was as if they were alive. "Go, now," the man screamed, his voice filled with panic. We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our things and ran, not looking back. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and warping, creating paths that led us deeper and deeper into the woods. No matter how fast we ran, the trees seemed to shift, guiding us further from the camp, as if they were trying to trap us. Eventually, we stumbled upon a clearing and eerie, silent place where the trees seemed to form a perfect circle. The ground was covered in strange symbols, scratched into the dirt. At the center of the circle stood an old stone altar, covered in moss. It was ancient, worn by time, and something about it felt wrong. As we approached the altar, the air grew, thick with a strange energy. We could hear the whispers again, louder now, filling our heads. "Leave, or stay forever." I turned to my friends, but they were no longer with me. I was alone. The forest had taken them, and I was left in its grip, unable to move. I tried to scream, but the forest swallowed my voice. The man's words echoed in my mind. "Stay away from the trees." I realized too late what the forest was. It wasn't just a place. It was alive, feeding on the souls of those who entered its depths. And once it had you, there was no escape. I don't know how long I've been here. Time has lost all meaning. The forest has claimed me, just like it claimed my friends. The trees whispered to me now, and I know that one day, someone else will walk into this cursed place, and the forest will take them too. And I will be here, waiting, just like the others. My name is David, and I've spent most of my life in the woods. My father was a hunter, and I followed in his footsteps. The forest was my second home, a place where I knew every trail, every hidden spot, and every sound. But that was before I encountered the lost hunter. It happened during a winter hunting trip, just a few weeks ago. The snow was falling heavily, and the air was biting cold, but I was used to it. I had my gear, my rifle, and I was out looking for deer. It had been a slow day, but I was determined to track something down. The forest was silent, save for the crunch of snow beneath my boots, and the world seemed still. I had been walking for hours when I noticed something strange. Off in the distance, I saw what looked like a figure standing between two trees. I froze, squinting through the snow. It was a man, dressed in hunting gear, but he didn't look right. He was too still, too unnatural. At first, I thought he might be another hunter, but something about him felt off. I called out, but he didn't respond. The figure didn't even move. I decided to approach, thinking maybe he was lost or injured. As I got closer, I saw that his clothing was worn and old, like it hadn't been washed in years. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. But what struck me the most was the way he stood unnaturally rigid, almost like he was frozen in place. "Hey, are you all right?" I asked, my voice cutting through the cold air. The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward me, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. His eyes were dark, black holes that seemed to pull me in. There was no life in them, no warmth, just emptiness. I took a step back, instinctively reaching for my rifle. But before I could react, the man raised his hand and pointed deeper into the woods. "Go that way," he whispered, his voice like ice. "It's waiting for you." The words sent a chill through me. I didn't understand what he meant, but something told me I shouldn't trust him. I turned to leave, but the man's voice stopped me again. "You'll never leave," he said, his voice growing colder. I took off running, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, not once, as I sprinted through the snow. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing together like they were trying to trap me. I couldn't remember the way back. The trail I had come in on was gone, replaced by an endless sea of white. I stumbled, falling into the deep snow, and when I stood up, the man was there again. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, standing in the trees, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I could hear them whispering, their voices rising in a haunting chorus. "Join us. Stay forever." I felt something cold and sharp touch my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see the man again, but there was nothing. Just the endless forest, the snow swirling in the air. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, pushing through the snow, but I couldn't escape them. The forest seemed endless. The trees towering over me, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft and distant at first, but growing louder. The whispers were closing in, and I knew they were getting closer. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke through the trees and found the main trail. I couldn't believe it. There was a familiar signpost pointing back to the road. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my legs weak and trembling. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. When I looked back at the forest, everything was quiet again. The snow had stopped falling, and the trees seemed normal. But I knew what I saw, what I felt. The lost hunter was real, and whatever he was, whatever he wanted, he had followed me out of the woods. I don't know what he meant by "it's waiting for you." All I know is that I never want to go back to those woods again. My name is Lucas, and I've always been a skeptic. I don't believe in ghosts, curses, or anything supernatural. But what happened to me in those woods, there's no logical explanation for it. And now, I'm not so sure about my old beliefs. It was supposed to be a fun adventure. I had heard about a hidden trail deep in the forest, a forgotten path that most people had never heard of. It was rumored to lead to an old cabin, long abandoned and left to rot by time. The idea of finding it intrigued me, so I convinced my friends, Kate and Ben, to join me on this hike. We set off early in the morning, full of excitement, ready to explore. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden glow over the forest. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling my lungs as we walked through the familiar trails. But then, as we ventured deeper into the woods, we came across something strange. A narrow path we hadn't seen before, almost hidden by thick underbrush and twisted trees. It was as if it had been deliberately concealed. Kate and Ben were hesitant at first, but I convinced them it was the forgotten trail. The idea of discovering something new excited us all. We stepped onto the path, and immediately, the air changed. It felt colder, heavier, as though the forest was holding its breath. The trees grew denser, their branches thick with moss and vines. The trail became uneven, winding and twisting. leading us deeper into the unknown. As we walked, I noticed something strange. The forest around us seemed to grow quieter. There were no birds, no rustling of animals, nothing. Just the sound of our footsteps, echoing in the stillness. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off. Nature is unpredictable, right? We walked for what felt like hours. I kept checking my phone for the time, but there was no signal, no surprise, given how deep we were. The further we went, the more oppressive the silence became. It was like we were walking in a vacuum, the air thick and suffocating. Finally, we arrived at the cabin. It was more run down than we expected. The wood was rotting, the windows shattered, and the door hung off its hinges. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but there was something else about it, something unsettling about its presence. It felt wrong. Against my better judgment, I pushed open the door. The inside was dark, damp, and smelled of mold. But what caught my attention was the wall on the far side of the room. It was covered in strange markings, carved into the wood, some of them still faintly glowing. Kate and Ben were already exploring the other rooms, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from those markings. There was a strange energy in the air, and I felt compelled to touch them. As my fingers brushed the carvings, I felt a sudden jolt, a cold rush that ran through my body. And then, the whispers began. They were soft at first, barely audible, but they quickly grew louder. A chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. Get out. I spun around, heart racing. Kate and Ben were still in the other rooms, unaware of what was happening. I tried to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The whispers became frantic, the sound of footsteps growing louder. The room felt smaller, suffocating, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see one of my friends, but there was no one there, just darkness. The shadows seemed to stretch and crawl along the walls, closing in on me. I ran. I didn't care about Kate or Ben, I just needed to get out. The cabin seemed endless as I raced through the rooms. But no matter where I went, the door was always just out of reach. Finally, I burst through the door, gasping for air. I turned to look back at the cabin, but it was gone. The path had disappeared, replaced by nothing but thick trees and underbrush. It was as if the forest had swallowed the cabin whole. I stumbled back toward the main trail, my heart pounding. But when I found Kate and Ben, they had no idea what I was talking about. They hadn't heard the whispers, hadn't seen the shadows. It was as if they had experienced something completely different. They just wanted to go home. We left the forest that day, and I haven't been back since. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, and I know that trail, that forgotten path, is still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. My name is Aaron. I used to love the forest. It was my escape from everything, my sanctuary. But that was before I found the tree. Now, I don't think I'll ever look at the woods the same way again. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me, my brother Jack, and a few friends. We chose a spot deep in the forest, far from the busy trails. I didn't think much of it. I've been camping in the woods countless times before, but something was different this time. We set up camp near a cluster of towering trees, their gnarled branches twisted in odd shapes. Among them, there was one tree that stood out, a massive, hollow oak, its bark twisted in strange patterns. It was unnerving, but we didn't think much of it. The night was clear, the stars shining brightly above. As we sat around the campfire, Jack brought up the rumors he'd heard about strange occurrences in these woods. People had said that there was something unnatural about the trees here, especially that one. They said it was cursed, that anyone who went near it at night would hear voices, see things that weren't there. We laughed it off, the alcohol and the warmth of the fire making us forget the strange feeling creeping up my spine. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as though the woods were watching us, waiting. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I needed some space, away from the fire and the laughter. I walked toward the edge of the forest, where the hollow trees stood in the distance. The closer I got to it, the more I felt a oppressive weight in the air, something ancient and heavy. The wind stopped, and the forest grew unnervingly still. As I reached the hollow tree, I couldn't help but stare at its massive trunk. The hole in the center was wide enough to step through, but something about it felt wrong. The bark seemed to pulse with a strange energy, almost like it was alive. I heard a noise behind me, a rustling of leaves. I spun around, but there was no one there. I was alone. But then I heard it again, closer this time, like footsteps moving silently through the underbrush. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could react, I heard a whisper. It was coming from the tree. "Help me." The voice was faint, barely audible, but it sent chills down my spine. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. I took a step closer to the tree, almost as if I was drawn to it. "Help me." This time, the voice was clearer, and I felt a strange compulsion to look inside the hollow. I stepped up to the tree and peered into the darkness. The air around me grew colder, and I felt something watching me from the depths of the hollow. Suddenly, a hand reached out from inside the tree. It was pale, skeletal, its fingers long and bony. I recoiled, stumbling backward, but the hand didn't stop. It reached further, and I could hear more voices now, faint and desperate. I turned and ran, not looking back. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning as I sprinted through the trees. But the forest had changed. The paths I knew were gone, replaced by twisted branches and dark, shadowy corners. I could hear the whispers following me, growing louder with every step. I ran for what felt like hours, my fear pushing me forward. Finally, I broke through the trees and found my camp. Jack and the others were still sitting by the fire, laughing, unaware of what had just happened. I tried to tell them, but the words wouldn't come. I was shaking, unable to explain what I had seen. I never spoke of the tree again, and the others never asked. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. We left the next morning, packed up in silence. The forest had swallowed my fear, leaving only the memory of what I had encountered. I haven't been back since. I don't think I ever will. There's something in those woods, something in that tree, that I can't forget. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I hear the whispers. Again, help me. My name is Sarah, and I've never been afraid of the forest before. But that night changed everything. The forest isn't just full of trees and animals. It's full of things that can't be explained. It started when I decided to take a walk in the woods near my house. I needed to clear my head after a long week of work. I've always enjoyed the peace of nature, the rustling leaves, and the sound of the wind through the trees. I never thought there was anything wrong with the woods. Not until that day. The trail was familiar, winding through the dense forest, but something felt different. It was quiet, too quiet. Normally, there would be birds chirping or the occasional squirrel rustling in the underbrush, but today, the woods felt empty. I kept walking, trying to push the unease from my mind. I had walked this trail hundreds of times before, so why should today be any different? But then, I heard it. A soft whisper. I froze, my heart racing. I looked around, but there was no one. The forest was still, silent again, as if nothing had happened. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then, it came again, louder this time. Sarah, ... My blood ran cold. No one knew I was out here. I was alone. I whipped my head around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just the shadows of the leaves swaying in the wind. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just a whisper, repeating my name in a voice that wasn't mine. Sarah. I turned quickly, walking briskly back along the path, my steps quickening with each passing second. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something just out of sight, something waiting. And then, I saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the trail. It was tall and slender, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. It stood still, watching me, and I couldn't bring myself to move. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It simply took a step forward, and another, until it was in front of me. The air grew colder, and the whispering intensified. Now all around me, I backed away, my legs shaking, but the figure followed. With every step I took, the shadows seemed to stretch, blocking my path, trapping me in this eerie space. "Sarah, ... The voice crooned again, but now it was joined by others, low, haunting murmurs, too many to count. The shadows swirled around me, pressing in. I could see eyes now, glowing faintly from the dark corners of the woods, watching me, waiting for me to fall. I turned to run, but it was as if the forest itself had shifted. The path I knew so well was now unfamiliar, twisted. The trees seemed to grow closer, their branches reaching for me, their leaves whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. And then, I heard the last whisper, "Stay with us." I didn't stop running, until I broke through the trees and found myself at the edge of the woods. Gasping for air, I stumbled out onto the road, my legs weak, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked back toward the forest, but the shadows had receded. The forest was silent once more, but I knew it wasn't over. I had felt them, those eyes watching me from the darkness. I haven't returned to those woods since. I've driven past the entrance countless times, but I never stop. The whispers still echo in my mind, and sometimes, when the wind picks up, I swear I can hear them calling my name. Sarah, the forest is waiting. It always is. My name is Daniel. I'll never forget that day in the forest. The shadows that followed me, they still haunt me, and I don't know if they ever will stop. It all began when I decided to go hiking alone. I needed to get away from everything. The stress of work, the noise of the city. I thought the forest would offer the peace I desperately needed. The trail was long, quiet, and I felt a sense of relief as I ventured deeper into the woods. As I walked, the sunlight began to fade. The trees grew taller and closer together, blocking out most of the light. It felt like I was walking through a tunnel of leaves. The air turned cold, and the quiet was almost oppressive. I didn't notice it at first, but as I walked deeper, I started feeling like I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. But then, I saw them, the shadows. Thin, shifting figures that seemed to follow me at the edge of my vision. I stopped and looked around, but there was nothing there, only trees. I kept moving, but the shadows were still there, moving with me. Every time I glanced to the side, they would disappear, but I could feel them, lurking just beyond the tree trunks. I picked up my pace, hoping to shake off the eerie feeling, but the further I went, the worse it got. The shadows weren't just following anymore, they were closing in. It was when I reached a clearing that I saw the worst of it. In the center of the clearing was a large, ancient tree, its bark twisted and gnarled. Beneath the tree, a dark figure stood motionless. The figure was barely visible in the low light, but I could make out its outline. It had the shape of a man, but there was something wrong with it. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, and its head, it didn't have a face. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the figure. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound, but I knew it was watching me. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. Suddenly, a voice echoed in my mind. A whisper that wasn't really a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I looked around, but there was no one else. Just me and the figure. The shadows had surrounded the clearing now, their forms shifting in the corners of my vision, growing larger with every passing second. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. My legs were burning, my breath ragged as I sprinted through the woods, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away from the shadows, away from the figure that still lingered in my mind. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest. My heart was pounding, and I could hear the sound of my own footsteps in the dead silence. When I finally made it back to my car, I was out of breath, drenched in sweat, and shaken to the core. I started the engine and drove away without a second thought, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave. The shadows, I knew, were still out there, waiting for me to return. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. It was always in the back of my mind, lurking, just out of sight. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, a trick of the light, the fatigue from being alone for too long. But every time I closed my eyes, I could see the figure beneath the tree, standing motionless in the shadows. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm walking outside, I feel the presence of something behind me, just out of view. I know it's them, the shadows, and I know they're still following. My name is Marcus. What happened in the woods still haunts me, and I can still hear the echoes. They're not just in my head. It started as an innocent hiking trip. My girlfriend Emily and I decided to spend a weekend in the woods. We left our phones in the car and followed an old, forgotten trail. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The birds stopped singing. The wind ceased. It felt as if the forest itself had stopped breathing. We came across a dilapidated bridge, the wood weathered and cracked. Emily hesitated to cross, but I convinced her. As we stepped to the other side, the silence became absolute. No birds, no insects, nothing. "Marcus," Emily said softly, her voice filled with unease. "Something feels wrong." I shrugged it off, urging her to keep going. I felt a strange pull to continue deeper into the woods, as if something was calling. We reached a clearing with an ancient stone circle. The stones were covered in moss, arranged in a perfect ring. "Let's leave," Emily said, her voice trembling. But I walked toward the center. Something about it felt ... right. As I stepped into the circle, I heard Ita whisper, "Come closer." It wasn't Emily's voice. It was soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Emily's face went pale. "Marcus, we need to go. Now." I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, listening to the whisper, which seemed to come from all directions. "Come closer," it repeated, and I did. The moment I stepped forward, the world around me seemed to shift. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching for me. The ground rumbled, and a cold wind carried a scent of decay. Emily grabbed my arm. "What's happening?" The whispers grew louder, closer. I turned to her, but she was gone. I called out for her, but she didn't answer. Only the trees and the whispers remained. I ran. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted through the woods. The trees seemed to close in on me, disorienting me. I couldn't find my way out. I called for Emily, but the only sound was my own voice echoing. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, days. Time didn't matter anymore. The whispers continued, growing louder. Finally, I stumbled upon the bridge again. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted. No sign of Emily. The woods were silent once more. Then, I heard Emily's voice. But it wasn't right. It was distorted, wrong. "Marcus, ... double quotes," she whispered. I turned, my heart racing. "Emily, come closer," the voice said, now right behind me. I spun around. Standing just beyond the trees was Emily, but she wasn't the same. Her eyes were black voids, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Her skin was pale, drained of life. She didn't move, just stared at me, her grin widening. "Come closer." I screamed and ran, not stopping until I collapsed, breathless. I don't know how I escaped the woods. When I reached the car, I was in shock. I went to the hospital. They said it was exhaustion, dehydration, maybe stress. But they didn't know what I saw. Emily is gone. Sometimes, I still hear her voice, whispering in the distance, "Come closer." And every time I step into the woods, I hear the echoes of that whisper. I wonder if she's still waiting. My name is Jason, and I made a mistake. A huge one. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. My friends and I, 3 of us, to be exact, decided to head out to a remote area in the woods for a little camping trip. We were looking for a break from our busy lives, and what better way than to get away from everything and everyone, right? Just us, nature, and a few beers. The drive up to the woods was smooth, the air crisp and clean as we ascended deeper into the mountains. We didn't think much about it, even when the paved road turned to gravel, and the signs of civilization grew sparse. We were eager to disconnect, to be free. After a couple of hours, we arrived at what was supposed to be our campsite, but as we unpacked, something felt ... off. There was an eerie stillness in the air. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural silence. "That's weird," said Matt, one of my friends. "There's supposed to be a lake around here. I don't see anything." I shrugged it off. "Maybe it's a little further down. Let's just make camp." We set up our tents and built a small fire, but the quietness was unnerving. It wasn't like any other camping trip I'd been on. The forest here seemed to press in on us, as if watching. By the time night fell, we were all feeling uneasy, but we didn't want to admit it. That's when we saw it, the cabin. At first, it was just a silhouette in the distance, partly obscured by the trees. We hadn't noticed it earlier. It wasn't on any map, and no one in the group had mentioned it before. "Let's check it out," Matt said. I didn't want to. I had this strange feeling in my gut, like we weren't supposed to go there. But curiosity got the better of me, and we grabbed our flashlights and walked toward it. The cabin was old, decaying. It looked abandoned, its windows dark and shattered. Vines climbed up the rotting wood, and the door hung on its hinges, as if begging to be opened. "It doesn't look safe," said Lisa, another friend, her voice tight with unease. But Matt, always the adventurous one, pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, sending a shiver down my spine. We stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was thick, musty with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched deeply into the wood, their meaning foreign and unsettling. "What is this?" Lisa whispered, stepping cautiously toward a corner. There, on the floor, was a large circle of dark stains. It looked like it had been there for years. "Let's go," I said, my voice trembling, but Matt was already moving deeper into the cabin. "There's a basement," he said, his voice oddly calm. "I'm going down." I tried to stop him. "Matt, no. Something's not right here." But he was already at the stairs, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I could hear his footsteps echoing as he descended. The silence stretched on, and then we heard it. A thudding sound, heavy and deliberate, coming from the basement. "Matt?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer. "Matt," Lisa shouted, rushing to the stairs. She grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We need to leave, now." But before we could even think about turning around, we heard a low growl, coming from the bottom of the stairs. Something was down there. Something that wasn't Matt. We froze. The growl deepened into something worse, a guttural voice, whispering, "You shouldn't have come." I couldn't move. The air grew colder, heavier. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind us. It was locked from the inside. Then, a shadow appeared at the top of the stairs. It wasn't Matt. It was tall, thin, and impossibly twisted, like a person but not. The figure was covered in dark, matted hair, its limbs elongated, stretching unnaturally as it moved toward us. Its face was a blur, just a mess of jagged lines and empty eyes. Lisa screamed. I grabbed her and pulled her toward the window. But as I turned, I saw the thing was right behind us. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, twisted teeth. It hissed, low and menacing. With one last desperate effort, I threw my shoulder into the window, shattering the glass. We scrambled out, the thing just inches away from grabbing us. We didn't stop running until we were back at camp, breathing, heavily covered in cuts from the broken glass. We didn't stay the night. We packed up in a frenzy, leaving everything behind. The entire drive back down the mountain, we didn't say a word. No one wanted to talk about what we had seen, but even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that growl, the whisper of the thing that wanted us to stay. And every time I drive past the woods, I wonder if that cabin is still there waiting for the next group of curious souls. I'm Ethan. I'm sure you've heard about those forest trails that people always warn you about. They say if you go down them, you might never come back. I used to think they were just stories, but that was before I walked the silent path. It started as a typical weekend hiking trip with my friend Ben. We were in the mood for adventure and had heard about an old, overgrown trail deep in the woods, known to locals as the Silent Path. According to them, the trail was cursed, and anyone who ventured down it would hear strange sounds, whispers in the wind, or worsey things that weren't really there. But Ben and I were skeptics. We laughed it off and decided to explore it ourselves. After all, we'd done plenty of hiking before. What harm could one trail do? We reached the entrance to the path just as dusk began to settle over the trees. The sun was low, casting long shadows on the ground. The trees seemed to close in around us as we stepped onto the narrow, winding trail. It felt different. The air was colder here, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Ben asked, looking around nervously. I nodded, but I wasn't so sure myself. The further we walked, the quieter it became. It was as if all the normal forest sounds, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves, had vanished. It was dead silent. Only our footsteps disturbed the calm. After an hour of walking, we came to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a large, ancient tree, its bark twisted and dark. A hollow lay in the center of the tree's trunk, wide, enough for a person to crawl inside. "Let's check it out," Ben said. His curiosity piqued. I hesitated, but I followed him anyway. There was something strange about that tree, like it was calling to us. As we approached, the air grew even colder, and the sky above seemed to darken. That's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Ben, but he was already staring at the hollow in the tree. Something was inside it. "Ben," I said again, more urgently, but he didn't respond. He was too focused on the tree. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. I peered into the hollow. There, in the darkness, something moved. I could barely make it out, but it looked like a face, pale and distorted, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. "Ben," I screamed, grabbing his arm and yanking him away from the tree, but it was too late. The ground beneath us shook, and the whispering voices grew louder, now echoing through the trees all around us. The sound was deafening. "Run," I shouted, but Ben was still frozen, staring at the tree. In that moment, I felt something cold, clammy hands grip my ankles from beneath the earth. The ground seemed to open up beneath me, and I stumbled, falling to the cold dirt dot. I could hear Ben shouting my name, but I couldn't move. The whispers were all around us, growing louder, more insistent. The tree's hollow opened wider, and I saw a tan outline of something tall and unnatural emerging from the darkness. It had no face, just a dark, looming silhouette with long, outstretched limbs. I pulled myself free and scrambled to my feet. I grabbed Ben, dragging him toward the trail, but he wouldn't move. He was still staring at the hollow, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Ben, we need to go," I cried, but it was as if he couldn't hear me. He reached out toward the tree, as though compelled to get closer. The whispers reached a crescendo, and I felt the weight of something cold and heavy pressing against me. I pulled harder, desperately trying to break him out of whatever trance he was in. Finally, with one last, forceful tug, Ben snapped out of it. He stumbled backward, his eyes filled with fear. "We need to leave." "Now?" I said, barely able to breathe. We turned and ran, the whispers following us as we sprinted down the path. The trees seemed to shift around us, closing in, blocking our way. Every time we looked back, the silhouette was closer, lurking in the shadows. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods. When we finally emerged into the clearing near the parking lot, the whispers stopped. The air returned to normal, and the forest seemed to settle down. Ben and I didn't speak a word to each other as we got into the car. We didn't need to. We both knew that something had followed us out of the woods. Even now, every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. And every night, when I walk alone, I swear I can feel the cold presence of whatever was in the woods waiting. My name is Oliver. I didn't believe in ghost stories or old folk tales, at least, not until that night in the forest. It all started when a group of friends and I decided to take a camping trip deep into the woods. We wanted to get away from everything, the city, the noise, the stress. Just a weekend surrounded by trees and silence, or so we thought. We arrived at our destination, a secluded area far off the beaten path. The dense forest surrounded us on all sides, with towering trees whose canopies blocked out much of the sky. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something unsettling about the place. The silence felt heavier than usual, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We set up camp, and as night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of nature, the chirping of insects, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, just as we settled around the campfire, we heard something else. I whispered at first. I thought it was the wind, or perhaps one of my friends playing a prank. But as the whispers grew louder, I realized they were coming from deeper within the woods. Soft voices, barely audible, but unmistakably real. "Did you hear that?" Sarah, one of my friends, whispered, her eyes wide with fear. We all fell silent, listening. The whispers seemed to grow stronger, closer, but there was no one around. No animals, no people, just the oppressive darkness of the forest. "I think it's time to go back," said Mike, his voice trembling. But we didn't move. For some reason, none of us could. It was as if the forest was keeping us there, forcing us to listen, to wait. I tried to shake off the feeling, but something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones. The whispers started to form words, there, meaning just out of reach, like they were trying to tell us something important. But no matter how hard I focused, I couldn't understand. It was like the forest itself was trying to communicate with us, and I was too ignorant to listen. Suddenly, the fire sputtered. The flames flickered and died out, leaving us in complete darkness. The only light was the faint glow of the moon, filtered through the trees. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, moving just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But as it came closer, I realized it was too tall, too unnatural. It moved like a person, but there was something wrong about the way it glided through the forest, as if it was part of the shadows themselves. "Run," whispered Sarah, her face pale. But none of us moved. The figure was getting closer, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. It was as though the entire forest was alive with them. And then, just before the shadow reached us, it stopped. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence. It was watching us. And then, in a voice so cold it froze my blood, it spoke. "Leave this place." The words echoed in my mind, vibrating through the ground beneath me. I could feel the weight of its gaze, but I couldn't move. None of us could. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the forest, leaving only the echoes of its warning behind. We didn't stay after that. We packed up as quickly as we could, scrambling to leave the forest, before whatever it was could return. But even as we made our way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The whispers still echoed in my mind, as if the forest was calling to me. We never spoke about what happened that night again. Some things are better left unsaid, I guess. But whenever I think back to that night, to the shadow in the woods, I can still hear the whispers, soft and faint, calling my name, and I wonder if the forest is still waiting for us.